Welcome to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs of California. I'm Michelle Meow, a member of the Board of Governors and also a producer here, in which I do my own programs called The Michelle Meow Show, your A through Z, covering the LGBT, LMNOP, and everyone in between. The Commonwealth Club has actually been around for over 120 years. Its focus and its mission is on civic engagement and bringing us together to discuss civic issues of our time, things that are very important. So today's discussion is going to be very relevant, especially if you're one that tunes into the news, whether real or fake these days, and we'll answer that. Just some housekeeping things to keep in mind. We are recording this for broadcast at a later date, so if you could silence your phones, that would be great. Bathrooms are right outside to your left. And let's have a wonderful, great program. I'd like to welcome our speaker today, a strategic futurist. I think that's a first for me, at least for my programs, and so we're excited to hear what this is all about. Let's welcome Jason Tester to the stage.
I've been doing work over the past about year and a half. Really, it started off, I want to say it started off intentional. It started off as just a calling, as something I felt called to do by the moment. And it started off organically, and it started off emergently. And then it became more structured, and it became more, I decided that this might be repeatable, this might be a process, there might be something here, we could talk about it. But what I want to do first, so that we're all on the same page, is to show you actually the two large projects that I've created over the past year and a half that really are the basis for everything we'll be talking about today as a methodology, as a practice. What are the ethics of this? But again, just to get us on the same page. Oops. So the first project is called Insurrection: An American Future. And I started this around August of 2024. Before that, leading up to that, I had seen a lot of what we as futurists call weak signals. These weren't, you didn't have to be clairvoyant. You didn't have to have access to work for the CIA and have access to classified intelligence. Basically, anywhere you looked, if you were looking for patterns, looking at these individual items of importance, you would be able to tell that President Trump, especially while he was starting around 2020, and for most of the time that he was out of office, he was not being subtle. He and his administration and people who worked for him and advisors were not being subtle that if they came back into power, they were very, very interested in deploying the military into American cities for immigration enforcement, to combat crime. President Trump, believes American cities are crime-infested hellholes. And really I thought a lot of people said this was to assert federal dominance in American cities. And so this is just a smattering of some of those weak signals, headlines from across the spectrum, from constitutional scholars, from former military officials, from legal analysts, from reporters, from mainstream reporting, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. And I started to collect all of these. And I thought to myself, this is something that we should be talking about. This would be a very serious and unprecedented change in the relationship between the federal government and cities, a very different way that America operates. And so I thought this is a story that should be told. One way this tweet really just captures it all for me, and specifically why San Francisco. President Trump he cites San Francisco a lot. He has for many, many years. But in this case, he said, speaking of failing badly, has anyone seen what's happening in Nancy Pelosi's district in San Francisco? It's not even recognizable. Something must be done before it is too late. I mean, and this is not subtle language, right? Something must be done. So I thought, I have I have decades of experience as a futurist, but particularly as a futurist who tells stories about the future. That's the one superpower I have, really, is telling stories about the future, helping people see future possibilities. And so I built a scenario in about 14, it takes place over about 14 postcards. The time frame is a little vague. But it's essentially, it's the premise of what if President Trump was reelected. Remember, I started this in August 2024, reelected, and decided something happened in San Francisco. And in the prologue to the scenario, I say, it could be a temporary riot on a weekend, right? That is just out of control enough for to give him an excuse to say San Francisco is out of control. I'm sending troops to restore order. And so the scenario kicks off with that declaration. San Francisco mobilizes hundreds, the largest protests since the Vietnam War. And they face off against the first troops that have arrived in San Francisco. I wanted to create images that really kind of, I have a standard of like, almost like punch you in the gut, I think, is a way that really draw you in. And the idea of troops commandeering, riding our cable cars as a means of transport, really, and, not only as a means of transport logistically, but also as a way of saying, hey, we are here and we are now in control of your city. And so this is early in that scenario when they're establishing their dominance in the city. We have the idea of that so many protesters are arrested by troops in the city. Protesters, people who are being detained for immigration enforcement, are being detained that San Francisco doesn't have the capacity to hold them. So we actually have to build temporary facilities to hold all the people that are being detained. This is a particularly very particular forecast. There's a technology in the military called the active denial system. It's a real technology and used overseas, and it's called a non-lethal weapon. It's used for crowd dispersion, and that little radar dish right there sends a heat beam that penetrates just below the layer of the skin, but it feels like your skin is boiling off for a split second, so that you'll do anything you can to get out of the path of the beam. And a lot of people had been predicting that, given this scenario, this is it hasn't been used domestically yet. I think given the 3 years that we have left, the 2.5 years that we have left, we may very well see this in an American city. The idea of immigration checkpoints, of residency checkpoints set up in neighborhoods around the city. And a lot of these are all postcards that I made in the fall of 2024, right? Extrapolating from these weak signals, trying to build a very plausible, non-exaggerated, yet it's still extrapolated scenario. And so many of these events, these vignettes, these scenes have come to pass in the cities where troops have actually been deployed since. I myself am a queer gay man, and I really, in all of my projects, I want to tell the story of what does LGBTQ, what does queer resistance look like? What is the queer impact of these policies and these proposals, these futures that I'm trying to depict? What is the queer impact? And in this case, LGBT people have led resistance for decades. And so I really wanted to tell that story of what if San Francisco were occupied by troops? What if we had a kind of a punk, drag, very queer, very flamboyant, the way that LGBTQ people would lead it? What if we had that kind of resistance in San Francisco? And one of the other postcards involves the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. So I invite you to check that one out online. The idea of that so many people, like that detainment center we saw earlier, so many people go missing and detained and just, swept off the streets, that people, their families try to find them again. And they'll do anything they can. They put up wanted posters. They'll find networks. Have you seen my mother, my brother, my niece, my nephew who was taken by these forces? And finally, this scenario ends on, I don't like ending things on tidy endings, I guess. So the end of the scenario, at least that you can see online of these 14 postcards, is a night of a night of intense resistance from the resistance underground in San Francisco. But it remains to be seen. It's honestly left on a cliffhanger as to whether the troops reassert dominance or the resistance takes control. Now, of course, like I said, again, I published this January 10th, 2025, 10 days before the inauguration. Which was also 6 months, nearly exactly 6 months before President Trump deployed troops to Los Angeles, and then troops to Washington, D.C., and then attempted deployments to Chicago, to Portland, to Memphis, and of course, as we all know, Minneapolis. There were a couple. I think we might get into this. This is something I'd like to say about this project. But as a futurist, we try to, accuracy is not the most important part of doing a futurist project. But even still, when you're a futurist, you want to get something right? You want accuracy, and so it's a cruel twist that my biggest nailed it moment as a futurist is the one forecast that I most wish I had gotten wrong, right? The thing I was most right about in my life is the one thing I wish I'd gotten wrong. And here are just 3 examples of ways of comparisons between this is a scenario, this is an immigration check in the mission in my scenario, and this is a real immigration check on a front porch in Minneapolis. I mean, I don't know. It's the similarities to me are uncanny. This is from my scenario, a dispatch, a postcard of the debris of a mistaken raid, looking for an immigration raid, looking for one family, but we're going to the wrong house in the Excelsior, and this is a photo of a real debris left behind by an ICE raid in an apartment building in Chicago. Very early in the scenario, I imagined that military officials would kind of usurp the steps of City Hall where the mayor usually speaks, and begin to assert, this is Operation Golden Glory. We are here to help you and save San Francisco. And here's is a real screenshot of Greg Bovino, who many of us know, the infamous Greg Bovino, giving an update in Minneapolis on Operation Metro Surge. So again, some really uncanny similarities that, again, I would give anything to have not gotten right. Now, after that, I didn't really. This was not to me a practice. This was not a methodology. This was something I just felt compelled to build because that slide I showed you, that collage of all those headlines. I'm like, if Trump is reelected, if he takes office again, something in my gut just tells me that we're going to see troops in cities, and lo and behold, we did. So, but it was still really just a calling and intuition. And I kind of had that same feeling as the One Big Beautiful Bill was working its way through Congress, and particularly what really spoke to me was that so many Americans, the poll after poll after poll showed that so many Americans could not name one major provision of the bill. And this is sprawling legislation that covers so many departments, so many policies, so many programs, and like a good plurality of Americans could not name one impact of this bill, one provision in this bill. And it was signed into law on July 4th, 2025, with still with being deeply, people who knew about it, it was deeply unpopular. And yet still most Americans knew very little. They knew next to nothing about it. The only thing they might have known was that it changed taxation on tips, right? Rather than that 11 projections showed that 11 million Americans would be kicked off of SNAP or would lose their health insurance, right? Those provisions. The bill moved so fast and really by design, it tended to be largely unknown until signed into law, until it was too late. And so I didn't quite this, I'll be honest, I didn't start this project in time to shape debate in Congress, to shape deliberation, to get people to call their senators and take action. But I still wanted to address that gap of people who this bill is now law. I wanted to show people what some of the consequences might be for real everyday Americans. I wanted to humanize this sprawling technocratic legislation. And so I made 10 dispatches. I call these 10 dispatches from near future America. They take place all across the country. And each one illustrates a different provision of the bill, a different new policy, a changed policy, a deleted program, a cut program. Everything ranging from a teacher stocking a secret pantry drawer in Los Angeles because so many kids are projected to go hungry through a combination of changes to school lunch programs, funding for school lunch programs, but also changes and cuts to SNAP. To the provision that veterans who had previously been exempt from work requirements for benefits now are no longer exempt. They now, regardless of their disability status, many of them now have to work 40 hours a week, the requirement to qualify. And the data shows that so many veterans do receive public assistance, do receive public benefits. So this is going to be a major consequence. Now, while the bill itself doesn't directly address child labor, it seemed to me such a natural story of parents who can no longer afford childcare because of cuts in the bill to childcare programs, because of states that have to shift funds away from childcare subsidies that they offer, shift those funds to health insurance, shift those funds to fund their SNAP and their food programs. That what if we see a resurgence of child labor? This is actually set in Iowa, which has a history over the last 10-ish years of continually loosening their child labor laws, lowering the age at which children can work, increasing the number of hours that young people can work. So in this scenario, it's actually a 10-year-old working a shift after school. There are changes in the bill to student loan caps, how much students for undergraduate and graduate students can borrow. So in this scenario, this is a pre-med student whose family cannot borrow the maximum amount that the med school that she got into, the med school will cost. And this is based on so many projections that when you can no longer borrow what the average amount that med school costs, that is absolutely going to change who has access to being a doctor, a lawyer, a nurse. These professions that all require professional degrees are going to be out of reach for people who don't already have the means to support that. There are going to be, I'll speed this up a little bit, there are going to be changes there are many, and I don't want to get technocratic here, but there's so many technocratic changes to nursing home. This is really a sprawling bill that I would argue that politicians did not want us to know a lot about before it became law. There are changes to nursing home staffing requirements, nursing home funding. The idea that, and in this scenario, a nursing home patient, her best friend died because of cuts of funding in the bill to nursing homes, because of staffing changes in the bill to nursing homes. A young girl who is helping her grandmothers One mother is caregiving for the other grandmother. But because of the bill and the changes to reporting requirements, so what you have to report, what you have to do to maintain your benefits. They're actually, one source actually said that they were counting on paperwork, the requirement, the burden of new paperwork to kick a lot of people off of benefits. That's where they were getting savings. They're calculating savings for the bill. They're hoping that paperwork would naturally kind of cut the roles of who's receiving benefits. The idea, this is from Pittsburgh in 2028, the idea of, of food cuts, that a health insurance provider, a fictional health insurance provider, might actually offer classes in edible weeds, in urban foraging, because of fewer people receiving food subsidies, because of mass hunger, and because of limited funds. There's a limited amount of resources to fix the problem. And so potentially creative solutions. And this is my version of ending on a hopeful note. My hometown of Detroit, this is a mutual aid service that steps in to fill gaps. And not only providing food to increasingly hungry people, but in this case, also electricity. We could do a whole discussion on just the changes to power generation, subsidies and funding that are in the One Big Beautiful Bill. But it's also expected that electricity rates over the next 5 to 10 years are going to skyrocket for everyday Americans across the country. And so in this scenario, this is a volunteer delivering not only infant formula to a mother in need, but also a portable battery to get them through the night. And every single one, I invite you, I invite you to check out these projects when you get home, right? Because every single one of these, and Michelle and I will probably get into this, but it's important to me that all of these projections, all of these vignettes, all these scenes, all these extrapolations that I made, these narrative leaps, are grounded in lots and lots of bipartisan, across the spectrum, credible evidence. And that's a big part of my work. And so those are the two projects. And I think Michelle and I are going to discuss what they mean.
First of all, before I get into the meat of the questions, these hard questions that you've helped me prepare for, I'd like to dial it back. It was, I can't explain what I was emotionally feeling as well as intellectually and mentally, because we're looking at, right, fake images or depictions of reality, but what you're trying to depict is actually happening. It is real in a lot of ways. And so I wanted to go back to your process and the decision to do photorealism journalism in this way for all of us to kind of absorb and understand what's happening politically. Did you do, did you break down the One Big Beautiful Bill first and then said, okay, these are the visions I'm seeing, and so I'm going to apply that into art form or the photorealism journalism that you have shown us today? Or what was your process?
Yeah. Like I said, I've been a futurist for 25 years, right? And most of that time, my specialty has been telling stories about the future. And there's a theory that really grounds all of this, and it's called episodic future thinking. And it's a research that shows that if we can experience a vivid, detailed, grounded, personalized experience of the future, right? Whether it's a vision, whether it's just an image, whether it's a narrative, whether it's a story, we are more likely to take that future seriously. We are more likely to say, this is something that could happen. This is something that could happen to me, to my society, to my neighborhood, to things I care about. And so my whole career has been building on that theory that if we can put people into into scenarios, and scenes that feel real, then the human tendency to discount, the future as being something, it's going to happen to someone else. It's going to happen. It won't happen, as bad as people say it will. It won't happen to me. It's down the road. I don't have to worry about it now. If we can get people to experience those futures today, they become more real. They become emotional. They become something people take seriously. And so that really gets at this whole kind of the format of, trying to set people into futures that for at least a moment, they wonder, is this real, right? And you want, that tension between, the questioning, is this real, and realizing it's not. In that moment, you can actually, people will engage with something as if it's real. They'll take it seriously. You don't want to leave people in that moment too long, because then you're just fake news, right? Then you're disinformation. But there's a power that can be constructively harnessed. I kind of call it constructive confusion. And I've just had over the last 20 years, I've had so much success of, it's not, tricking isn't the right word, but really getting people to briefly consider, oh, what if I was in this future for real? Whether it's a newspaper from the future, or it's a product from the future that they pick up and wonder, is this real or not? Or it's photojournalism from the future, right? There's a power there to get people to consider consequences, to consider policies and proposals and potentials that they just would not have otherwise.
You said earlier that you had wished we were talking about this, or you had presented, the project more maybe like in January, or January during the inauguration of re-election of President Trump. Mm-hmm. I have to be honest with you. I think that if these images were presented to me at that moment, mm-hmm. I would have been like, no way. I wouldn't have been able, or maybe it would be like a part of me that would say, I don't want to believe it, that we could get that far.
Right.
So with that being said, how do you counter the people who might argue with you that, well, this is fake, or it's fake news?
Right. I mean, I will admit, I certainly did feel, do people know the story of Cassandra from Greek mythology? She was gifted to foresee the future in perfect accuracy, but cursed that nobody would believe her. And I have to admit, I felt like between publishing that in January 2025, right before the inauguration, and troops being deployed to LA in June, for those 6 months, trying to get people to take this seriously, I really did feel like Cassandra. I'm like, I really think there's something here. And even if I mentioned earlier that the power of what makes something, how do I put this? Creating something from the future can be beneficial, even if it doesn't come true, right? If it's plausible, if it would be impactful, if it would be consequential, then it's worth, at least to futurists, it's worth getting people to care about it. It's worth getting people to consider it, to spend a little time in a scenario exploring that, because the impacts, the consequences might be so great, even if the probability is low, right? And I'm not sure. I mean, I guess I haven't cracked that yet, and how to create something that is, I try to not be hysterical. I try to not extrapolate too far down any road of being overly dramatic. But I did get that reaction a lot of nah, this is he would never, he's all bluster. He would never send troops. He may threaten it, but he would never send troops into cities. Right. I was accused of being alarmist. I was accused of, maybe accused is the wrong word, but, labeled as being a bit dramatic, right? Being over dramatic. And so I think that's next, right? Is how do you raise possibilities for people in a visceral way that they'll stop scrolling, right? They'll grab their attention, they'll stop scrolling and consider it. And yet still feel actionable, right? There's something, maybe it was a lack of, actionability. I mean, also remember January 2025, this is when Doge, all the mass layoffs were hitting, there were other things by design. There were other controversies and other, provocative proposals in the news every single day that any one potential, that seemed hypothetical, it can't get the traction. There's a term, I don't know if we talked about this, but the term of flooding the zone. And this is something that the Trump administration, particularly in the second term, has actively been pursuing as a strategy. They define flooding the zone as unleashing every day a new controversy, a new provocation, a new proposal, something outlandish, something provocative that no one possibility, no one potential can get enough sustained attention, can get enough oxygen, in our attention environment for society to debate, to discuss it, to consider it, to take it seriously as something that could happen. And so, I think this was kind of, I don't want to say a victim of flooding the zone, but the zone is so flooded right now, and it's still flooded every single day, that some things that are really looming possibilities, they just can't get the sustained attention and the traction, that they warrant.
Yeah.
For how plausible they are.
There's a lot.
Right.
There's a lot. On the other hand, you had mentioned that, the Insurrection Project, you were right about that, but actually you're right about a lot of things. You're right about everything you presented, in the two projects there. And so what about being right about these things make it, dark, and or maybe even for you wanting to be wrong about your predictions?
Right. I said this, I kind of previewed this a little bit when I said, the value of good foresight, right? Of beneficial foresight is not predictive accuracy, right? It's not getting it right. And even though that helps, but if something is, if a potential, is could be consequential, will be impactful if it happens, but if it's, if it's a 5% possibility, but a 90% impact to our way of life, right? Then that's worth spending some time trying to shake people awake, and say, let's talk about this. Let's consider this. It's so, being right helps in a way. And I think certainly, going forward, I might have a little bit more credibility. I might be able to avoid the Cassandra problem next time. That if I carefully, if I scan the horizon, if I look and see what is the next consequence, what is the next looming potential that's worth narrativizing, right? It's telling stories about, making images of, that, getting people's attention about. Hopefully, I'll have a little more credibility to kind of break through and have those scenarios, have those depictions.
Yeah.
Be taken seriously.
Yeah. No. Yes, you do. I do. Now I want to ask you, okay, what's going to happen by the end of the year? What's gonna happen next year? Right. Is this guy ever going to get out of office? What's his eventual, fate? Not that I just want to focus on the president, but there's a lot of things happening, like global conflicts and this fear that we may run out of, supplies. I mean, you started to talk about that in your project, and I don't know, maybe we just go there now. Like, what are some of the predictions that you have that you could be working on in the near future here?
Well, and the first thing that comes to mind is very much is related to the how I built this, right? And at some point I figure we're going to talk about the role of AI. But I don't know if there was a post that went viral recently, and it said that we're at a moment right now, the impact of AI, that we were at in February 2020. February 2020 was about a month before the lockdowns started, right? It was people were going about their business, as this post says. People were, flying. They were going to parties. They were planning summer soirees, right? We had no idea that life was about to dramatically change. And this person is saying, this person works in AI, and they're saying that we are there right now in terms of AI's impact, particularly on employment, but also on geopolitical balance. It's going to make COVID look like something that we just wrote out really easily, right? In terms of how disruptive this is going to be, and in a way, that's what I feel like that would be. There are lots of other things that the Trump administration has done in the first year: cuts to scientific funding, right? Cuts to the federal workforce. All those are going to have implications 10 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road that are absolutely worth telling stories about, creating photos of, creating vignettes, creating characters that can bring those to life, right? But in terms of just what I'm seeing in terms of what is the most consequential thing that is worth doing anything to shake people awake and say something massive is about to change the entire world, it would be it's the impact of AI.
Yeah. Want to go into that?
Sure.
I mean, you might be one of the only few voices that I know in my inner circle who's doing something good, with it or talking about it in this good way. Like, this potentially could save democracy. Whereas, those who are not necessarily big AI enthusiasts or are kind of looking at it like it's too much of a big disruption in our lives, will say the opposite, that people are using it for all the wrong reasons, and it could be the end of humanity as we know it.
Right. I will say one area that I don't want to say I'm sensitive to, but I've worked really hard to distinguish the work that I'm doing and this what I'm starting to call methodology in a practice of speculative journalism. I'm working really hard to distinguish that from the way that AI is being used for disinformation, for deep fakes. And to me, it's a lot about transparency. It's a lot about grounding what I'm doing in incredible sources, in research, in expert analysis. It's being really transparent about the fictional framing of this, like saying this is not real. This is in the future. This is hypothetical, rather than a lot of memes, a lot of AI created deepfakes and memes, and the kind of the ways that AI is being weaponized, are deliberately very much by design, leaving all those caveats, those watermarks, those warnings. They're leaving them off, right? Because they want to confuse, they want to mislead, they want to instill false and sometimes, what's the word I'm going for? False beliefs and, really kind of upend systems by changing opinions and being persuasive and manipulative in that way. And that's to me, that's one way that AI can be, that generative AI particularly, and the products of generative AI can be used for good. It's not enough to say that my intent, I mean well, right? My intent is civic preparation, so I can get away with doing this, and other people cannot, right? I think there are a lot of there's kind of like a code of practice that I would love to start to create of people who are using AI for beneficial purposes, right? And who agree to abide by these codes of transparency, of sourcing, of being upfront, of not hiding, of letting people, see this may be the final product. This is how it was made, right? And if you disagree with this, create your own. Follow the research, follow the sources, create your own. And that's what a lot of propaganda and disinformation and deepfakes very much. That's by design. That's what they're not doing, right? They want to trick. They want to mislead.
We'll take questions from the audience. I think we have a microphone that we're going to pass around. If you have a question, just raise your hand. I'm going to actually read this question. You wrote it for me to read. And so I wanted to make sure that we asked this. It's an important one. Who gets to depict other people's futures? Mm-hmm. You're a white man imagining futures for communities of color, immigrants, queer people, veterans. What gives you the right?
Yeah. And I'm thank you for asking that. And anyone who would do this work and not care about that, I would, that's a red flag to me. I think I have two answers, and I think one is kind of procedural and processy, and one is personal. And the process one is, I didn't just imagine, do my best to put myself in the shoes of communities, identities I don't belong to, right? And project hardships onto them. Those same reports, those same analyses, that same rigorous standard of evidence that I used as sourcing for all these projects, they are the ones who are projecting and talking about, these marginalized communities, these vulnerable communities, these or marginalized or vulnerable identities. These will be the people most affected by these changes, by these provisions, right? They're the ones doing the research into, and segmenting those impacts by demographic, by identity, by community, right? And so I'm very much relying, just as I don't like to extrapolate that. Like, I don't like to take narrative leaps, right? I like to base everything, even if I have to, if I to tell a little narrative about it, I want it to be based on evidence, on, really strong, because I want these to be taken seriously. So everything you see in there, like the pre-med student, who goes to a historically black college, right? She's a senior. She's applying for med school, and you see in the postcard that she's devastated because she got accepted in med school, but also told that because of the new lifetime student borrowing cap for graduate school, right? Her family cannot borrow enough to pay for the 4-year medical school, right? And so there are a lot of people who were leading up to the bill's passage saying that, hey, if these student loan changes happen, then that's going to limit who can become, that's going to limit who can become a doctor and a lawyer, right? So, traditionally lower income communities will be shut out because they can't, those student loan funds, those mechanisms by which they could have access to professional schools will be gone, right? This will be the domain of the rich. And so, telling that story, it wasn't just me like imagining, well, I should have a diverse cast of characters. Well, I should tell a student, tell a story from the Black perspective. This is very much based in evidence, right? The personal reason is that, I'm a queer gay man. I use both terms, right? Who came of age, who grew up in the 80s and 90s, right? And so I have a lot of personal experience, as many people in the room I know do, of other people telling stories for me, right? Telling stories about me, telling stories for me. You probably have this experience too, right? Yeah. And, so that's something I'm really sensitive about. That doesn't give me a pass or permission to tell, ungrounded, made up stories about other people, but it certainly gives me, I think it gives me a sensitivity and awareness that I don't want other people telling my stories, right? So if I'm gonna do that for other communities to help them imagine futures, I'm gonna base it in as much reality as I can.
So I guess before it becomes real, because you were right about a lot of your predictions, right? So it's hard to look at it from the perspective like, well, it hasn't happened yet, so we're just speculating. Mm-hmm. What's the impact in the outcome that you desire from that? And I think, right, like when it is just speculation, but then it becomes a reality, how does this, like, what do you want people to take out of it? Is it going to be something that we could use, you think, like, for example, in elections? Like, we could use this type of storytelling with the hopes that there's impact, during our elections, but for good, like electing good people versus, taking fake news and electing bad people or people who don't represent your values.
Right.
Your thoughts?
I have long hoped for many, many years now that political campaigns might get to a point where stories like the stories about the visions of the future, right? I mean, a lot of ways that we distinguish between politicians, a lot of ways they try to distinguish between themselves is what is their vision for the future. But those are nebulous. Those are kind of academic sometimes and esoteric and just hand wavy. And what I think design storytelling that I'm trying to do here has the potential is to actually like one candidate could put out a vision of the future based on their preferred policies and proposals that would people could actually inhabit, that they could actually get a feel for what living in that future would be like, right? But then there could be a competing vision of that future, and so I think that could actually elevate our political campaigns beyond mudslinging, beyond really kind of just poetic, lofty language about what the future could be, and actually help people understand, put their be in the shoes of someone in that future, right? Imagine, like, walk around in that future. That's what I would hope. I think I really want to I started the Troops and Cities project in August 2024, right? I meant it to be like a 1-month project. And I ended up publishing it in January of 2025, right? So that took about 5-6 months. I would love to shorten to get troops, to get groups of people of different specialties as the technologies and the tools improve, that we could create rapid response futures, right? I even had this idea that, what if a nightly newscast, I mean, that shows how old I am, I guess, but what if like the daily news could actually include, could report on what's happening, and right alongside that could include what might happen scenario. Like what if one New York Times article, say, could be, past context background. Here's what's happening now. Here's what might happen in the future. Here's what it might look like. Here's a story about it. Here's a character about it. That would be really cool. I think if this actually if journalism becomes past, present, and future all in one, because we can make these vignettes, these photos, these stories so quickly.
Here's a question that you have that you wrote for us. You said that this work was self-initiated. No one commissioned it. So how do you sustain yourself? I wanted to ask this just because we started talking about AI and its disruptions, and it can be massive, and everybody's worried about, how it's disrupting the labor industry, right? Mm-hmm. So let's talk about it from the perspective of being able to utilize it for good, but how do you sustain yourself for it?
Yeah. Personally, just speaking about these two projects, they were labors of love. They were labors of hundreds of hours and months of work, and honestly, like more than lots of money in AI payments. Like every single image that you saw up there probably was the result of about 100, 200 candidates for what that base image would be, and then about 50, 60 hours per image of hand refinement in Photoshop. Wow. Right. So these were labors of love, because I just felt a calling. Like I felt these are futures that people have to be aware of, and I have the superpower. It's the one thing I could do on this planet. I have the superpower to tell these stories, right? But this needs, if we limit the potential to tell a few stories about the future, if we limit it to people who can, whether by have the means to support themselves, then we are absolutely narrowing the aperture of whose futures get told, whose futures get realized, right? So this needs to be I'm not always necessarily a fan of institutionalizing things, but this absolutely needs institutional support. This needs think tanks. This needs foundations. This needs, this needs greater resources so that it's no longer the domain of people who can just, who can be, I don't think I'm a dilettante necessarily, but, people who can do it as a hobby, people who can do it for fun. I want anyone to be able to receive funding no matter their income situation, no matter their, that they don't have to hustle and work to be able to create a story, to tell a vision of the future that they have in their mind. I want them to be able to do that as a job, right? And to do that, to focus on that. And that will dramatically expand the accessibility of telling stories about the future, right? We'll hear more voices. We'll hear from so many different communities and cultures, right? Beyond just those who can support themselves.
If the New York Times is tuning in, I think there's a new role just come up with, thanks to you. We have a question from the audience.
I love this. This is really fascinating. I work in the field of design, and we're always trying to imagine the future, and here is a vehicle for doing that. Well, one of the things I wonder, and when I hear about this is, and you hinted at it, it's like, okay, how do we access that story? What are the channels for all of these different people from all these different perspectives to receive it? We feel right now a great dissolution with, truth or news or however that's coming. If we speculate journalistically about a mature speculative journalist profession, what does it look like in 10 years?
Well, I think I maybe gave a little preview of that, in that it goes beyond, both of these live basically as websites, right? That people you have to either, be sent the link or type in the URL, right? And visit it. They're best viewed, because of the way I made the images, they're best viewed on laptops, right? Which already cuts away like half of the audience of people who visit the web on mobile, right? I mean, there are mobile versions, but they're not as good. I would love this to become, like I said, your journalism today, generally reports on what happened or what is happening, but there's not really a journalism beat of what could happen. And so either that we have a new, I don't want to say a new section, or maybe it is a new beat of, here are future stories based on those other two categories of what happened, what's happening, what could happen, or that they just get so embedded in traditional journalism that, like I said, you're reading about what happened. You're reading about yesterday, the events yesterday, or the events 2 days ago from the war in Iran, right? But at the same time, that same article, that same piece of news, whether it's video, whether it's text, whatever it is, also has a component, that is just seamlessly part of it, that imagines what could happen. And it's not, and it won't be considered journalism taking going out of its, getting too big for its britches, or being out of a zone where it shouldn't be operating. It'll be, if it's done journalistically, if it's done with rigor, if it's done, using evidence and grounding in the same way that traditional journalism is, that will be taken seriously, right? It'll still be a what if, but right now we're pretty good at what was, what is. Why not do what if? And why not have that be just a part of the news, part of our stories, part of our, right now the future is something that we do not really talk about. I've been a futurist for 20 years. The future is something that people do not like talking about, right? It's not, our brains aren't wired for the future, to think about the future. It's uncomfortable for a lot of people. A lot of people think they're not good at imagining the future. They don't want to imagine the future. So I think it's not just a change of speculative, of making journalism more about the future. I think, what if we can create a societal kind of upswell of more conversation about the future? I think that's what might be where it has to start.
Hey, I'm your fellow futurist in Afrofuturism, and I'm like always taken by your pictures of resistance. And I was just thinking about, if we think about a scenario of of how the resistance might deploy AI in a responsible fashion instead of large language models, but the diffusion of AI into small language models that people have access to and can pioneer in and innovate for their local communities. What might that look like in, say, 2035? And how would you, picture that too?
That's a great question. I mean, your work, Lonnie, this is Dr. Lonnie Brooks, Afrofuturist and professor at Cal State East Bay. Your work on ancestral intelligence, I think, is very much a part of this as well. Wouldn't you say that, that AI, beyond centralized? I mean, right now, these AI tools are largely centralized. They're centralized, right? And they could be shut down at a moment's notice. They could be censored at a moment's notice. There are topics that you can't talk about. If resistance groups, if opposition groups could deploy this intelligence in ways, I mean, to customize, what would a queer LLM look like, right? What would an and a black culture focused LLM look like? That could change a lot. It could open up access to new people, more people, not only access, but people could be more invested in these tools. That's what I think is let's take it off central control.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, kind of thinking about DeepSeek and how it kind of upended the model of NVIDIA or, OpenAI. It's so interesting that kind of the way that China's deployment of it is a different parallel universe than ours. And just thinking about that. But I'm all for the mothership AI.
Say more about the mothership.
Well, mothership AI is kind of based in the traditions, practices of the Black diaspora and indigenous peoples through ancestral intelligence, through the erasure of our futures 500 years of oppression. Now we're resurrecting them, finding them, discovering the undiscovered stories of our peoples, and then amplifying them into the future, like, the Black Panther movie. How can we do more of that? And that's what I would like to see through your work and our work combined. So, I'd love to collaborate with you.
And I mean, we can use AI to tell stories, to make humanizing stories about future uses of AI. I mean, absolutely. That could be one. That's a great combination.
Well, this sounds very powerful. So I'm going to ask the other side of it. But then what about the people who use it for, not these reasons or for bad reasons? The bad actors.
Yeah.
I
mean, at the end of the day, I'm a storyteller.
Yeah.
I'm a flashlight, and I want to shine a light on possibilities and potentials, and that are just not being discussed, are not getting the oxygen, the attention that they need, right? And so that's, at the end of the day, that's any tool. For me, any technology, any tool is just a means to grab attention, to tell stories. And so, that there are so many scary, nefarious, centralized, dystopian uses of AI that are, the technology is happening so fast that we don't really have shared model. I mean, Terminator, right? It's the closest thing we have to a shared cultural model of AI gone bad. We need more nuanced, more technologically accurate stories and shared scenarios of how AI might go bad, right? But we need people to make them. Right. This is democratized storytelling, and we need, we're just at the beginning right now where anyone, I've been doing this for a long time, but anyone can step up and tell a story about the future. And we need that. The future is unfolding and accelerating so quickly. There's so many potentials for positive changes that we haven't seen yet, for new systems, new structures, but also new risks. And I want people to use these technologies, these rapid, lightweight, quick to deploy, quick to realize tools to tell stories, that we haven't heard yet.
This has been a real fascinating evening and conversation, Jason. Thank you for presenting it here. I have one final question. So I started off the program by, there is a question from the audience. Okay, well, We'll go 5 minutes after. Okay. We'll take this one last question.
Hi, I'll try to make this quick. I learned a lot from this, and I'm definitely going to look it up when I get home. You mentioned kind of waking people up from their scrolling, and part of that is also like they're in a bubble of their own kind of like media ecosystem. And I'm just kind of curious if maybe a certain framing or strategy or ingredients that have kind of reached across the aisle and maybe resonated with people that might not be watching this online or in this room that might, help with that groundswell of acting upon it.
I mean, there's, I have in both projects, I tried vigorously to not let my personal political beliefs, my personal political viewpoints and affiliations enter the story. I tried to treat, look at where the evidence, the grounding, the projections from experts, and like I said, experts across the spectrum, think tanks across the spectrum, or nonpartisan sources like the Congressional Budget Office, right? Was for the One Big Beautiful Bill was so many of my sources are from Congressional Budget Office estimates, right? Which is a nonpartisan. But I would love to see, like I said, I want this to be, I want to see an explosion just in the way that YouTube, TikTok, now we went from, 20 years ago that very few people could make movies, could tell stories. And now we have YouTube and TikTok and people do it, billions of times a day. That's kind of what I want to see with future storytelling, with telling stories about the future. Now that everybody has the tools, let's have everybody create, and let's encourage them to tell their own stories about the future, even from partisan viewpoints, and the ones that are the most persuasive, the ones that stand out will naturally attract more eyeballs, will naturally, break through and sustain attention. And so that's what, rather than, the kind of traditional storytellers, traditional institutions, aiming to be as nonpartisan, as bipartisan as possible, let's let partisan stories, future stories of the future rise up and be exposed to all of them. You scroll, flip every 10 seconds, you maybe see a different one, right? And, in the same way that, things go viral, things naturally float to the top. I think that will happen too, just within this genre of scenarios about the future, potentials about the future.
Sure. Very quick. One last comment or question. Oh, it's for broadcast, so we want your questions recorded. Thank you.
Thank you. Thinking about journalists, there's like investigative journalists where you have like different viewpoints coming together. There is also journalists of opinion. I think I'm translated from Spanish where somebody's maybe expressing their opinion to a journalist. So there are different types of journalists. And I was wondering if you have played a bit with in your artifacts with those type of journalists and the frameworks that they have to create these stories on this different journalist framework, if it makes sense, of type of journalists. Yeah.
Short answer, no. I haven't yet. I created these two projects and then after the fact said, hey, what I'm doing is kind of like a methodology, is kind of a practice that, is what I'm calling speculative journalism, right? It's what futurists have done for a while. It's what journalists have done for a while. And there's like a Venn diagram overlap, in terms of what this looks like when we apply different journalistic models and theories and principles and practices to it. I don't know, but that's why I'm kind of doing a talk like this and sharing this publicly is, it's really, this is a call. I want this to be a call to action for more people to create things like this, more stories like this. And then I think if we have enough, as these examples build up, then we can work backwards. Then we can create taxonomies, and we can understand processes and different schools of thought about them, right? But I think we're at the very, very, very beginning of it.
Mm-hmm. So just to put a nice bow on our conversation, again, Jason, thank you so much. It's been incredibly fascinating. Hopefully we all walk out of here either telling more stories in this way or, I guess, creating futures that we actually want to see, I think, is where you wanted to go.
Exactly.
So 120 years ago or so, right, FDR made his Great New Deal speech at the Commonwealth Club. And then there was a huge shift for everybody, right? For you, you're here at the Commonwealth Club, the longest, oldest public foreign affairs organization in the country. What are your last thoughts? What do you want us to walk out of here? And if there is going to be a big change because of your work, what would that look like? What would it be?
I think it would be kind of I'm going to say it's the message that I've kind of been trying to hammer home this whole talk is that, it's 2026. The tools of creation are literally in everybody's hands, whether you're creative or not, whether you're skilled or not. I really just want to see in the same way that anyone can upload a TikTok video, anyone can upload an Instagram reel, right? Let's if you have an idea, a vision for what could be, tell that story, right? Even if it's you speaking into a camera, right? It doesn't have to be special effects, doesn't have to be fantastical imagery. Let's start talking more about the future. So, in 100 years, if we are given all the changes that are about to happen in this century, right? If we need to make futures conversation a part of the language of everyday life, part of our everyday language. And that's what I would love to see, is that it's no longer this like esoteric ivory tower. I worked in a think tank for 20 years, right? I know, that these can be esoteric ivory tower, cloistered kind of jobs or reports and visions, right? I want them to be grounded. I want them to be, vernacular. I want them to be everybody talking about them.
Everyone, Jason Tester.